Ko mātua te waka, ko silisili te maunga, ko moana nui a kiwa te moana, ko ngati hamoa te iwi, ko mata ili ili whaisto uta te marae, ko Sā Aiono te hapu, ko Sarona Aiono-Iosefa ahau. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rau rangatira mā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Mā lo lava le soifua maua, ma le langi e mamā. Warm Pacific greetings. You'll have to excuse me, feeling a bit nervous. So what do you think about when you hear the word superpowers? I began school at Kendall Primary in Burnside, Christchurch as a 5-year-old. On my first day at school, the only words I knew were please, thank you, toilet, mada, fada. English was my second language. I spoke Samoan fluently. There's no TH in the Samoan language, so there was a lot of laughter in the playground that day whenever I talked about mada and fada. My parents had such great faith in the New Zealand school system that they felt that the teachers could teach me English far better than they ever could. My parents' job, as they saw it, was to ensure that we never let go of our language or our culture. It was like wearing a cape that you wore to school to speak English, and then as you came home, you slipped out of that cape and you only spoke in Samoan. I didn't realise it then, but Mum and Dad really were instilling in me superpowers. You see, they were great storytellers. Mum through her Samoan songs, which she sang wherever she was, and she sang that to her grandchildren. And I now, since she's passed, sing it to my grandchildren. In the evenings, they would lead what we call our lotu in the Samoa, which is a form of devotions that we had in the evening. And we would read passages from the Bible, each taking our turn to read a verse each, and also sing a hymn and say prayers, all in Samoan. But I used to look forward to Dad's summaries of the story, which was better than watching a cowboy movie, I thought, because he'd talk about David and Goliath, about Daniel going into the lion's den, and it was fantastic. I loved it. And it was this bedrock of imagination that from this bedrock of imagination, I developed a lifelong love of language, words, and storytelling. Particularly how stories help to embed ideas, concepts, and open up a world into everybody else's worldview, even if you didn't know them, as long as they were the author of the story. And so for me, this is the household I grew up with. I grew up with a father who pursued knowledge his whole life, despite working as a cleaner at the School of Engineering at Canterbury University at nights, and also working as a spinner in the carpet factory during the day. He was a voracious reader of books. In 1967, we outgrew this little church that was on the corner of, still is actually, on the corner of Worcester Street and Manchester Street. And we joined up with St. Paul's, which was a Palangi church. We were all Pacific Island. And there, Dad met 3 men who would have quite a big impact on his learning. One was a professor of civil engineering, one was a professor of history, and another was a doctor of medicine. Dad would ask them for books that he might want, that he might read to better his knowledge of God, of religion. And so they would give him this list. And every Monday night, without fail, Dad would take us kids and him along to the local library, and he would look for these books while we exchanged our books. And then sometimes Dad would go early to his cleaning job at the university because he'd meet these professors and he'd ask them about these books. And this is how my father, the cleaner, got to debate God's existence with different academics from our church. So both Mum and Dad had quite a wide circle of friends, and they were always curious about them. And so they had Niuean, Cook Island, Samoan, European, and they wanted to know how they brought up their families, how they ticked, and so forth. So for me, it's coming from a family like that, always curious about the world. It's no surprise I trained to be a journalist. Ended up working at the Christchurch Press newspaper for 18 years. First as a reporter, then as a sub-editor. And I learned how to gather information, write stories to deadline, and produce news. But I often struggled with the lack of diversity in the newsroom. Pacifica and Māori always appeared in either the courts pages or the sports pages. And so I started trying to write stories about minority groups, about how they were great communicators, they were pioneers, and they were pillars of the community. So when I moved on to, great innovators. And when I moved on to work at the Christchurch City Council, I was lucky enough to work under the mayoralties of Gary Moore, who is here tonight with his family. Welcome, Gary. And also with Bob Parker. But my favourite event that I did at Christchurch City Council was the Heritage Week in 2007. And we called it Pacific Pathways. And that was the first time that I started working with our Pacifica people, and I realised what power we have in our communities. I worked with Pacific Underground, and yes, that is Dallas from Fat Freddy's Drop. And this is where we are pioneers. He started singing here in Otautahi, and then went on to form the band that he's in now. And so for me, it was like finding our communities and how we come up with an idea and we just deliver it. We never let anything get in the way. And this is where I learnt what it was like being Samoan in the workplace and bringing new ideas on how to tackle inequality. So what's the relevance of all this to my work now in 2021? I'm now working as Principal Advisor Engagement for the Ministry for the Environment in Wellington. And it's like everything that my mum and dad ever taught me, as well as all the jobs I've ever had. And I've worked for coal mining, I've worked for Meridian Energy, and I've worked for Oricon, which is an engineering company. All of that now brings me to be able to put that into action. Because we're at a crossroads here in Aotearoa now. Our environment is under huge pressure, so we need to make changes now. Most of our rivers in urban and pastoral areas are polluted. Urban expansion of housing is eating into some of our most valuable food production land. 90% of New Zealand's original wetlands, which act as the draining and filtering natural areas for our fresh water systems, are lost. Almost 2/3 of our natural rare ecosystems are threatened with collapse. Almost 4,000 native species are threatened or at risk of extinction. Climate change has resulted in New Zealand's greenhouse gases increasing 20% since 1990. We were the 4th highest producer of greenhouse gases in the OECD countries in 2016. Although fishing bycatch of protected species is decreasing, it's still the main threat to our seabird populations, 90% of which are at risk of extinction. Coastal areas in New Zealand, for example, are in danger from rising sea levels and the extreme weather events occurring. If we want to ensure that our children, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren can swim in the same rivers that we do, can gather seafood along the same coasts we do, we need to actively look to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, clean up our waterways, and actively manage how we live and work daily. For our Pacifica communities, for us, we have to fight it on 2 fronts: the impacts of the environment. While we look to reduce our family carbon and waste footprints in Aotearoa, many of us still have families back home in the islands. The danger is that our families back home in the islands could become climate change refugees in the next few years. And that's because governments may be forced to take whole populations inland or actually move them off the islands that they've lived on for generations. The environmental issues we face are so large and complex that one knowledge system alone, especially the Western knowledge system, won't fix them all. We need our Indigenous knowledge and systems more than ever before in the public sector. And we need to give those solutions as an Indigenous people. My Pacifica lens means I always seek community-based rather than individual solutions. Our greatest strength is because we work as families and communities, we can mobilise quickly with the right resources and support in government. This is becoming our superpower, the ability to work together efficiently and effectively toward a common goal. Whenever I struggle at work, I think of how our small, pioneering Pacifica communities rallied during the 60s and 70s to build their churches, and then they just got on with it. This is how our parents and our grandparents have done this in New Zealand, America, all over the world where they migrated to. I transfer that sort of thinking into government, and where it's increasingly important for us to pull our Pacifica skill sets and strengths because our people continue to feature large in the negative statistics of Aotearoa around education, health, welfare and justice in New Zealand. Māori, Pacifica and new migrants live in areas of the highest deprivation, making them the most vulnerable to change. My role is to support the ministry to give voice to these groups. And it's hard because to date, the ministry was a policy-making office that often didn't connect directly with communities. Climate change and the need to ensure our environment can still sustain our growing population means the ministry needs to change how it works. Many Pacifica families are too busy putting bread on the table to have time to feed back on environmental policy that's going to transform the way we live in the next few years. So I'm relying more and more on how our Pacifica people have always worked together. The government can't do transformational change on its own. It relies on the same spirit shown during COVID lockdown and certainly in Ōtautahi following the 2 big earthquakes. So this is the only way that we'll be able to make the fast transition that we need to get ahead on carbon reduction. The biggest challenge for Pacifica people in government is that often our ideas are harvested and contractors will harvest the ideas and present them back to government as theirs. It's important that when we present our ideas that we're given credit. Too often we're not. Our knowledge of how our communities work and think now has a dollar value in today's job market. So we need to leverage it within the frameworks of our cultures. This is the point of difference that we bring. When our employers say, bring your authentic self to work, make sure that means you get the credit for the authentic and unique mahi that you do for them. One of my biggest learnings in my work life is how reporting lines can hide the real ideas people in an organisation. Add to this ambitious managers and true ideas people become almost invisible. So write it in your performance goals, socialise your work plans and ideas far and wide in your organisations so everyone knows your mahi. Put your unique stamp on everything you do. Work with other Pacifica people in your workplace to draft Pacifica strategies, to put in place processes and approaches for building Pacifica capability and capacity. But don't forget what our parents taught us, to work together and support each other to improve and shine. Our language, the way we carry ourselves and how we look after each other speaks to who our parents are, where we come from, and what oceans we have yet to navigate. We can never forget we are children of the voyage that still continues today. Those navigator dreams live on in us and all who follow us. We never achieved any of our voyages alone. That is not who we are. We always took our families with us. If not physically, then always in our actions. My father always said to me, and I think he was writing this for 660 at the time, don't forget your roots, don't forget your family. So in closing, for me, it's about channeling the superpowers of our languages, stories, and families to guide how we think, walk, and talk in the workplace. We resolve issues from our point of view to make it relevant to our Pacifica communities so they can influence local and central government decision making. Remember, we are stronger working together towards a sustainable environment for generations to come. We pass this way only once with the environment, so we need to get it right. Everything that used to make me doubt my worth, that I didn't attend the right schools, that instead I had parents who couldn't speak English, and I came from a community where anyone who owned 2 cars was really rich, and where I learned not to moan about oxtail soup, fish head soup, or kidneys for dinner. All this now makes me an asset to government. Because I've lived the life, I have experienced that social and economic struggle, and I can still speak what is now my second language in order to help Pacifica people understand why their voices must be heard at local and central government. If we get it right for the most vulnerable communities, we get it right for all of us in Aotearoa. I am the product of Pacifica navigators who charted their course by the sun, stars, moon, and tides. We are more than enough. Kia ora.